This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Human Action Podcast. Today I am going to discuss the forever interesting topic of whether economics is a real science. So the motivation for this, just let me give you the background in terms of what pushed me over the edge to talk about this and some of the particulars I'm going to get into in this episode, was a Twitter battle, as often happens, which guides my day and my thoughts. So here we'll flash it up. So the backdrop here, I only grabbed a particular nested version or subset of what was going on here. But this guy, Jostein Hogg, sorry if I'm butchering your name, sir, he had come out swinging, you don't see it here in the screenshot, saying that economics by its very nature is very political and ideological, and it's not scientific the way the other disciplines are. And then he listed a bunch of reasons that he thought it was necessarily ideological. Okay, and then this guy Matt Darling chimed in, who goes out of his way to defend orthodox economics. Like, one of his favorite things is to go around and just anytime someone cites some stat about the median household income, Matt Darling will come along and correct the person. Just nope, nothing to see here. Everything's fine. No rock in the boat. There's a reason things are the way they are, and suck it up, sir. So that's kind of his role in these things. And so he was chiming in to this Jostein guy, saying like, oh yeah, all these reasons you're listing as to why economics is ideological and political and blah, blah, blah. And he said, just like biology, chemistry, and physics. That was Matt Darling's. So now this guy responding to Matt Darling says, these hard sciences have much more robust laws than economics. For example, no law of economics can be as easily tested and empirically debunked/verified as the law of gravity. Yet, many economists claim that their field is a real science. It's not. All right, so you see what he's getting at there. And let me just go ahead, and while I have this screenshot up, I'll explain the rest of the jocular banter. So then Alex Tabarrok, economist, the GMU, chimes in and says, explain this, physicists, showing a picture. I'm narrating this, folks, because some people are just listening to the audio, showing a picture of a plane either taking off or landing. And then Alex has in parentheses, economists get challenged with equivalent questions every day. Okay, so presumably, what Alex has in mind, in other words, is to say, oh, wait a minute, if there's a law of gravity, then how come planes can go up in the air? I thought, shouldn't they fall towards the earth? And so obviously he's saying other things counteract that. And then presumably what Alex has in mind is that if somebody's, I don't know the specifics of what he means, but I guess somebody could say something like, well, geez, you economists said that tariffs would cause consumer prices to go up. But look at actually, consumer prices haven't gone up that much this year. And so you guys are wrong. Or you economists said raising the minimum wage would lead to large unemployment among unskilled workers. But no, this state raised their minimum wage, and actually the fast food restaurants hired more kids the next summer. So what about that? Right. So Alex's point is, in economics, we can talk about particular causal forces, but there's so many things going on in an actual historical episode that sometimes the thing you're focusing on gets swamped by other factors. All right. Or, geez, you economists think everybody is greedy, but actually, some rich guy wrote a check and funded some local softball team. So I guess that goes out the window. Your models with your egoistic, rationalistic behavior, right, be another example. Okay, so now to explain my zinger. So then I came in responding to Alex and said, if engineers knew why planes crashed, there wouldn't be any plane crashes. Okay, so by the end of this episode, you will fully understand the majesty and wit packed into my little zinger there. So what I was actually doing there was making fun of economists. A lot of people, as so often happens on Twitter, thought I was making fun of engineers, and they were coming up and telling me No, dude, because I can see you're an economist, so you must be tribal and you must be defending your guys. No, engineers actually can do da-da-da-da-da, and that's why we're so much better than you idiot economist. Again, I was making fun of economists there, right? So what Alex was trying to do in this exchange was to chime in and say, oh, it's funny that you're sitting there trying to say how physics is so much better than economics and more scientific, but a lot of the challenges that we get as economists for people, outsiders trying to blow up our discipline and say how stupid we are and how we can't look out the window and see reality compared to our, false assumptions or unrealistic assumptions, that actually people are just misunderstanding how economics works. And he said it would be analogous to someone looking at a plane taking off and saying, oh, geez, I thought you physicists said there was a law of gravity, right? So Alex is clearly circling the wagons and defending economics as a science. And so then because I had recently interviewed somebody on this very topic on a different show about, the use of mathematics and economics and so on, and then I brought up this issue of a lot of people say economics is overrated and you economists at MIT and Harvard and whatever walking around thinking you're geniuses and that you've got your sophisticated mathematical models and so forth, but you guys didn't know the 2008 crisis was coming, right? What good are you if you can't even warn us about an impending global financial crisis? And the response to that, or one response to that kind of an objection, is to say, oh, no. By its very nature, stock market crashes can't be predicted. Because if 6 months ahead of time, all the smart people knew that the stock market was going to crash in the fall of 2008, well, then what would they have done? They would have gotten out of the stock market to try to get out before the crash happened. But that just means the crash would have occurred in the spring of 2008. Right? And so the idea is that's why you can't predict a stock market crash. And so you can't wag your finger at the economists for not predicting the financial crisis because, that's misunderstanding how economics works. And it just shows, if you think that, it just shows you don't understand economics, pal. Why don't you go take a class in Chicago price theory? Duh. Okay. So where am I going with this? What I'm trying to show here in my little Twitter trolling comment is to say that typical defense of the legitimacy of economics and how economists often defend themselves when outsiders say, you guys are a bunch of clowns. I'm saying, imagine if somebody else tried to use that defense in some other discipline, how goofy that would sound, right? So imagine a plane crashes and people get mad at the various safety, inspectors and the people who built the plane or whatever, the whole infrastructure. People are questioning, saying, all you people whose job it is to run the airline industry and to build planes and whatever and regulate airspace, this is a problem. Why did that plane crash? And then imagine if somebody said in response to that, well, let's think about this. Suppose all the smart people knew, like the pilots and everybody and the people, running the airline companies and things like that. Suppose they all knew a week ahead of time that there was going to be a jumbo jet crash that was going to kill 200 people next week. Well, they wouldn't have run that flight and the people wouldn't have gotten on it and the pilots certainly wouldn't have taken off. And so the crash wouldn't have happened. So you can see it's kind of silly to say, how come you guys didn't predict the plane crash? Because if we could have done that, then the plane wouldn't have crashed the way it did. Right? So do you see why that defense, it's actually not wrong, right? What I just said is actually correct. If people could accurately predict a plane crash and know that, oh yeah, the way things are going a week from now, that 747 is going to crash and kill 200 people. And so if a bunch of insiders, smart people knew that was going to happen, then they would change their behavior such that that would no longer happen. Like the timeline wouldn't go down that path anymore. So that's true, but the conclusion is not therefore. So anytime there's a bad plane crash, it exonerates everybody involved that you couldn't have expected them to see that coming, right? And so likewise, yes, given that there was a global financial crisis in the fall of 2008, if we just stipulate that that happened, and then you say, could it have been, predicted by all the smart people, and could all the economists at MIT and Harvard have known that was coming? Right, they couldn't have, given that it was going to occur. But still, you're allowed to ask after the fact, how come you guys didn't see this coming and avert it, right? That's kind of the issue, right? So it's not so much like sometimes people try to make analogies with earthquakes and say seismology is a real scientific discipline. It's an empirical science. And the fact that, if a major earthquake hits and the seismologist didn't give a warning 1 week out, that doesn't prove that the science, that it's just alchemy or something, right? Okay. I mean, you would want them to get good at predicting it, but right, the mere fact that sometimes a quake happens and that doesn't disprove it. But part of the issue is, at least with our current level of technology, we think we can't stop the earthquake from happening, right? It's not that we built the Earth's crust and the reason earthquakes happen is because of what we're doing. I mean, people talk about fracking and stuff, and you can get into that, but you get what I'm saying in terms of major earthquakes, especially looking backward in time. It's not that those happen because of human activities. Okay, whereas a financial crash, part of the reason the critics are saying or packed into it, how come you didn't see this coming, is they mean because if you had, we could have done things to avert that. It's not just saying, yes, we know that every once in a while there's going to be a global financial panic and we want some more of a heads up next time. That's really not what they mean. Okay, so let me, now that I've walked through that and sort of given you the motivation I had for this topic, let me circle back to an earlier Mises.org article that I did, because I want to give you folks some more meat here in case you think I'm attacking a straw man or I'm just like going after people on Twitter or something. So back in November of 2009, I wrote an article, we'll link to it, of course, in the show notes page here, called Economists Can Be Hilarious. This was a Mises Daily. And ironically, what kicked this off was that Paul Krugman was criticizing orthodox economists for not for relying too heavily on what's called the efficient markets hypothesis, or the EMH. And so partly what's going on here is Krugman was able to do that because the EMH is associated with the Chicago School. So a bunch of people that Krugman doesn't get along with, because he's an MIT guy. And so like the Chicago guys and the people associated with the efficient markets hypothesis, they came in and, in the 60s and the 70s kind of blew up the prestige of the Keynesians, warning about stagflation, coming up with critiques like of the nature of the crude Keynesian models. And then this like Robert Lucas in particular, comes up with, saying that the agents of the model should have rational expectations, things like that. Okay. And so out of that Chicago school tradition comes the efficient markets hypothesis. You can see people advancing it with various degrees of purity, let's say, or claims that they're making on its behalf. But that is what it is. And so Krugman wrote a piece, this is a year after the financial crisis, criticizing his Chicago school rivals and saying that, they gave this false sense of assurance and so on. And actually, these old school Keynesian models are much more useful in a financial crisis. That these Chicago guys are insane. A lot of them don't even think a bubble is possible. Okay. And that's not a straw man. That Eugene Fama, for example, was interviewed after the crash and they were asking him about the housing bubble. And he said something like, I don't even know that term has any operational meaning. Like, if everybody knows housing's overpriced, then they would just sell. So like, no, that doesn't, after the fact, prices go up and prices go down. And if they go way up and then come down fast afterwards, we can say that was a bubble. But what does that even mean? Okay, so that's how methodologically committed he was to the efficient markets hypothesis, that he was saying even after what happened in 2003 through 2007, he was saying, no, what do you mean there wasn't a housing bubble? Was it? He literally saying, what do you mean by that? Like, just like, I don't even get what you're talking about. Okay, so Krugman actually is not attacking a straw man here. So what I did in this article is I went through, so in the wake of Krugman's attack, and then other people too were saying, like, what the heck is going on here? How come, the economists didn't see this coming? The orthodox defenders of the EMH circled the wagons. And so in this article, I had some excerpts of people commenting on this stuff. So let me just read you some quotations, and then I'll give some responses myself to what they said. So Robert Lucas, again, who's one of the biggest guns in this field, Nobel Prize winner and so forth, he says one of the things he wrote is, one thing we're not going to have now or ever is a set of models that forecast sudden falls in the value of financial assets like the declines that followed the failure of Lehman Brothers in September. This is nothing new. It has now been known for more than 40 years and is one of the main implications of Eugene Fama's efficient markets hypothesis, which states that the price of a financial asset reflects all relevant, generally available information. If an economist had a formula that could reliably forecast crises a week in advance, say, then that formula would become part of generally available information and prices would fall a week earlier. All right, so let me just pause and react to that for a bit, because that's a central argument in all this stuff. I would encourage listeners, if you've never heard that kind of an argument before, don't just dismiss it as sophism and just say, oh, come on, that's just, you're arguing in a circle. That's just gobbledygook. Get out of here, right? Even though, I may have led you to want to conclude that based on, my earlier analogies with the plane crashes and such. Okay, but there is a certain profundity to that perspective that in some settings I think is quite useful. So for example, if somebody's got some newsletter for their subscribers that tells them here's how to beat the market, and you do this foolproof thing, and we've gone back and we've analyzed this past data, and it's like every Tuesday, the first full Tuesday in a new month, or the first Tuesday, every month, we've found this pattern that these particular stocks always go this way, and so we've back tested this pattern, and if you had followed this strategy starting in 1960, you'd right now be up blah 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 percent. Okay, and so what's interesting about something like that is there's lots of things that could go wrong with that. Maybe they're not taking into account volatility or something like that. Maybe it's a very risky strategy, but beyond all that, the point of the efficient markets hypothesis is if you then started trading on that, like let's say it really was some pattern that was in the data that was real, like for whatever reason that, there was this arbitrage opportunity that nobody had noticed up till then. But what's interesting is once people started trading on that and profiting, it would quickly get, competed away. So that pattern would disappear. And there's examples of this actually happening in the real world where, various people watching the stock market found some patterns that were in the historical data. In other words, that people had not made money off of, but they just noticed these patterns like, and so they would construct like a hypothetical trader who, if he had been following this strategy starting 10 years ago, at this point would be up, so much relative to the market index. And so now we're going to go do that and be that guy. But it just doesn't work out the way it should have. And it's like all of a sudden that pattern just disappears. And so when you understand the logic of, Fama's framework, it makes sense. Like why that pattern, why you would see that. Okay. And, intuitively, the idea is that if you see this opportunity, well, when you're buying, you're pushing up the price. And if you're selling something, you're pushing down the price. So the very act of you getting in and trying to profit from this arbitrage opportunity, you kind of whittle it away. And that, especially if the secret gets out and more people learn about it, such that it eventually becomes, quote, common knowledge, well, then clearly there can't be this arbitrage opportunity that everybody knows about, right? Like, to pick something goofy, somebody says, oh, you know what? Every July 4th, people blow up a lot of fireworks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, in mid-July, invest heavily in the stock of companies that make fireworks. And I'm going to make a killing. And obviously, the market already knows that, right? That's already priced in. Okay, so that's the idea, that in order for you to profit on something, you have to have access to inside information. And that, what's the best gauge of the public sentiment about something? It's the existing market prices. Okay. And then related to that, yes, it is a narrow, it is a true statement insofar as it goes, is to say, if most of the informed people on Wall Street, or, people trading financial assets, were pretty sure there was going to be a big crash next month, then that wouldn't happen, because that would just pull forward and the crash would happen this month, because people would try to get out early, and then in the act of doing that, they would crash the market now, right? So that's all true. However, I think that proves way too much. All right, so let me just here quickly give some of the pushback to that, again, very typical defense of orthodox economics. Is, for one thing, people analyzing the market have different theories. And another element, too, is sometimes their, quote, predictions are more open-ended. So, for example, if you read Mark Thornton, or if you watch Peter Schiff when he was making the rounds on like CNBC and stuff like that in 2005, 2006, Thornton very presciently wrote out things, and it's eerie how accurately he predicted the contours of what was coming. And Peter Schiff, again, nailing it in terms of saying, this is the situation we face, housing's overpriced, this is going to happen, da, 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 da. And people were laughing in his face. Okay, so when you say, if somebody is arguing and saying, based on my understanding of how the economy works and how the world works in financial markets and blah, 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 I think we are in store, there's a giant bubble right now that's going to pop. It doesn't work to say, well, no, because if everybody knew that, then the bubble would pop right now. It's because that's the whole point. This person is one voice, he's bearish, and there's a bunch of bulls, and they're vying for the public's attention, and they all have their newsletters or whatever, their platforms that they're telling people, this is what I think's happening. Okay, so that's one element. So it doesn't really prove that somebody was wrong, right? In other words, Mark Thornton could have been perfectly correct in what he was saying, and the fact that other people ignored him and kept pushing up housing prices, that doesn't mean he was wrong, right? So there's that element. And then more generally, you could be giving warnings, qualitative warnings, and saying, hey, this is a very risky system we're fostering here, and this will make it much more likely that a crash will happen. I can't predict exactly when. And to give you an analogy, like before the Hindenburg, somebody could say, hey, having balloons filled with hydrogen seems like a bad idea, and maybe we should switch to a different gas. And, you could be correct in saying that. And if somebody says, oh, well, then predict and tell me exactly which, when is something bad going to happen? And you say, well, I can't tell you which particular flight. I don't know. I'm just saying you're asking for trouble doing this, and we should do something else, and that will make it much less likely that a major explosion is going to happen, right? So in a situation like that, can you see why it would be goofy just to say, Well, I mean, that's impossible. Nobody could know something like that. I mean, if everybody knew that Hindenburg was going to blow up, then nobody would get on it. So how could anybody have known that ahead of time? Right? You see how goofy that would be in that context? And I'm saying that's just an analogy to show theoretically, in principle, maybe the economists who warned about a crash have a point. I think they did have a point in reality, right? We Austrians think that partly what happened in terms of the 2008 crisis was earlier, that the Fed and the commercial banks in the system that, the authorities have set up were allowed to pump in a bunch of artificial credit, not backed up by genuine saving, pushing interest rates down to artificially low levels that fueled the housing bubble. And there were other, government policies, Fannie and Freddie and all that stuff that kind of steered that excess liquidity into housing. And, I'll link to some if you've never seen, actually my book, Understanding Money Mechanics from the Institute. I have a chapter on applying standard Austrian business cycle theory to the housing bubble and empirically, and just showing how the Austrian story fits the facts nicely, in case you haven't seen that ever done. Okay. So I'm not just merely armchair theorizing and saying, oh, the economy is bad, the government must have done it. Like, I can show how the Austrian story fits the facts. Okay, so if that's what we're saying, then it's not at all a response to that to just say, well, geez, if everybody knew housing was going to collapse, then it would have happened earlier. Like, right? And okay. Yeah, and if more people had listened to Mark Thornton early on, the bubble wouldn't have gotten as big as it did. But they didn't listen to him, so that doesn't prove, just like the Hindenburg blows up, that vindicates the critics. It doesn't show that the critics didn't understand chemistry or something. Like, it's a goofy way of proceeding. Okay, let me just read some more here. I just have to read because it's so funny. Lucas wrote this really long article on this stuff. And he says, The Economist, like here he's referring to the magazine, The Economist. The Economist briefing also cited as an example of macroeconomic failure the, quote, reassuring simulations that Frederick Mishkin, then a governor of the Federal Reserve, presented in the summer of 2007. Okay, so Frederick Mishkin, who was a governor at the Fed in the summer of 2007, had all of these computer simulations showing that, the economy was fine. Because at this point, people were worried about the subprime mortgage market and housing prices in general, wondering if things were problematic. And so, Michigan has these models showing that, no, this situation looks all right. The charge is that the Fed's forecasting model failed to predict the events of September 2008. And here's the money line. Yet the simulations were not presented as assurance that no crisis would occur, but as a forecast of what could be expected, conditional on a crisis not occurring. Until the Lehman failure, the recession was pretty typical of the modest downturns of the post-war period. There was a recession underway, led by the decline in housing construction. Mr. Mishkin's forecast was a reasonable estimate of what would have followed if the housing decline had continued to be the only or the main factor involved in the economic downturn. All right, so I don't think I need to do much more except just make sure you realize the move he just made there. That, again, everything blows up in this fall of 2008. After the fact, people are trying to figure out what the heck happened. How come we didn't have early warning of this? They're looking at this Frederick Mishkin guy who, in the summer of 2007, in his capacity as governor at the Fed, and he's author of like money and banking textbooks and stuff too. This is a big gun in the field. He had produced some computer simulations of the economy, just saying like, no, it's, things look all right. Like, yeah, there's a fall off in construction and that's going to have reverberations in demand and this is going to happen. And okay. And so we're going to see some rise in unemployment in these sectors and blah, blah, but nothing, to write home about. And then the world blows up a year later. And so people are saying, hey, he kind of missed the boat, right? Giving the economy a clean bill of health 14 months before the world blows up. And the way Lucas is defending that is to say, no. His model just said so long as there's not, a financial crisis, things will play out smoothly. Like, I mean, again, you could have somebody sign off on the Hindenburg taking off and say, yeah, so long as there's no combustion going on that we're not taking into account, everything should be fine. Okay. And then here's another goofy one that I'll read for you folks. It's this guy, David Levine. And so he had this open letter to Paul Krugman responding to Krugman's scurrilous attacks. And he says, the predictive failure is not a problem of the field. It's a problem for those who are under the impression that we should be able to predict crises. Do you number yourself in this bunch? Do physicists get it wrong because their theory says that they cannot predict where a photon shot through a sufficiently narrow slit will land? Economic models are like models of photons going through slits. Just as those models predict only the statistical distribution of photons, so our models only predict the likelihood of downturns. They do not predict when any particular downturn will occur. Saying, quote, most economists fail to predict the downturn, which Krugman had said, is exactly like saying most physicists fail to predict the impact of the 12th photon passing through the slit. Okay, so that's just ludicrous. If you're not familiar with physics and what he's talking about, there's a famous genre of experiments called the double slit experiment. You should go watch a YouTube video on it or something if you don't know what I'm talking about, because it's really fascinating. It underlies like quantum physics and why it's counterintuitive and stuff like that. Okay, but the idea is that, particles sometimes behave as if they're waves, and when if you have a piece of paper with two slits in it and you shine a light on it and each individual photon going up, you don't know ahead of time, like you can't predict which slit it's going to go through. And all you could do is on the back end, of the paper on the other side where the light collects, and you can kind of look at the patterns that, that's what you can see. But all it is a statistical thing, right? Because they're saying like there is no fact of the matter of where the photon actually is. Okay, it's only afterward when you observe that you know what path it took. Okay, that's kind of what he's getting at. Now, quantum mechanics is experimentally verified to an unbelievable precision. Okay, so the idea that he would say, oh yeah, we're basically as good as the people in quantum physics, it's hard for me to convey to you how ludicrous of a statement that is. Okay, and no, it's not that Michigan said that, oh yes, here's the probabilities of recession, and that there's any sense in which, like, oh yeah, he didn't literally know that the 2008 crisis was coming, but he gave us a good sense of the probability. Like, no. And another thing too is with some of these models, in terms of the ones that like were giving AAA to some of these mortgage-backed securities and things, it was like the type of event that happened in these models was like, should have happened one every 10,000 years or something. And yet it happened. So yeah, you can say, well, the model said it could have happened. I guess it's just as a 1 in 10,000 year event, where it's like, sure. But on the other hand, what would have to happen for us just to say those probabilities are wrong? Okay. And specifically what was going on there is some of these models that like the quant guys at the hedge funds and stuff were using to evaluate, or at the credit rating bureaus to evaluate the mortgage-backed securities. They knew that real estate could go down, but they thought that each market was independent, right? So they thought, oh yeah, there's a decent chance home prices in Miami go down 40%, and there's a chance that home prices in Phoenix go down 40%, or in St. Louis or whatever. But they thought those were independent statistical events. And so they looked backwards in time, and they built in, safety margins for error and stuff like that. They weren't being stupid, and they didn't think they were being reckless, but they just thought real estate's local. And so they thought, oh yeah, if there's a 1 in 10 chance that real estate prices are going to fall that much in Miami, and there's a 1 in 10 chance that they're going to fall that much in Las Vegas, they thought the chance of them both falling that much simultaneously is only 1 in 100, because it's a 1/10 chance times a 1/10 chance, right? And so then when you have a mortgage-backed security, which has got little bits of mortgages spread out all over the country, they thought they were being very well diversified. And that's why for some of these things with the tranches that were, like the first to get paid, they were getting AAA ratings, because they were like, the only way these things would fail is like if the real estate market across the whole country went down all at the same time, what are the chances of that? That would happen every 10,000 years. All right, so that was the intellectual mistake behind this stuff besides all the other stuff going on. Okay, so that's kind of my response to the efficient markets hypothesis and the way that that's been used in these debates about is economics a science. Let me now just pivot and talk a bit about the broader question, is economics a science, and how do I feel about that? And here I'm just saying what I think is pretty standard in the Mises Rothbard tradition of the Austrian school. So Mises did think economics was a science in the sense that it studied regularities and social phenomena, and that there were patterns in the marketplace that were definitely objective, and that like the political authorities had to take this knowledge into account when they were setting policies, and that if their subjects were behaving in a certain way, that it wasn't just a failure of sufficient penalties to get them to do what the authorities wanted. That no, they were like, no, if you think prices are too high and you just make it illegal for merchants to charge above a certain price, that doesn't just keep everything affordable. That just means the goods disappear from the shelves, right? Like stuff like that. Or geez, if they debase the coinage and then they pass a law saying merchants have to accept the debased coins as if they hadn't been debased, all that does is mean people hoard the good money and then they transact with the bad money, stuff like that. And Mises said, and they realized that this new accumulating knowledge of the people writing down and noting these regularities in the marketplace in response to government edicts, that he said that it wasn't history and it wasn't math and it wasn't chemistry. What was it? It wasn't law. And he said eventually that's now what we call economics. Okay, but Mises placed economics as the most developed element of a broader area of human inquiry, which he called praxeology, the logic of action. All right, and so economics, or what he could call catalactics, was like the theorems you could deduce in the broader praxeology category if you also added in the institutional setting that there was private property and people were using money. If you had those, because that in general, just because people act, they use means to achieve ends, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's private property and the use of money, right? So the stuff you could say with the approach of praxeology, if you made those additional assumptions, is what Mises said that, yeah, that's what we kind of mean by economics proper. All right. So how does that proceed? What's the method of praxeology? Is Mises thought it was a priori. It was just logical, deductive reasoning. You start out with certain axioms and then you end up with conclusions deductively. So you don't go test them. So that is radically different from the empirical natural sciences. All right. And so the problem is nowadays, and you saw that in the screenshot I showed at the beginning, when people want to argue, oh, is economics a science or not? And people are comparing it to physics or chemistry. The people who think economics isn't a science and they hold up physics and chemistry as like the quintessential examples of genuine science, they mean because, oh, look at how rigorous this stuff is. We have quantitative laws that make very specific predictions, and those things have been, borne out many times in the laboratory and out in the real world. And so that's why we believe in physics and chemistry. And they also would say, and that's why it works. That's why we can put a satellite up in orbit. That's why we can make an atomic bomb and so on, whereas you economists are just bumbling around. You don't even see a financial crisis coming. What are you good for, right? But a Misesian would object to that and say, you're wrong for therefore concluding that economics isn't a science, because all you're really showing is it's not a science in the way that physics and chemistry are sciences. But economics is quite rigorous, but by its very nature, it proceeds in a different fashion according to a different method. And so a better analogy for economics as opposed to physics or chemistry is geometry. And so nobody denies that geometry is very rigorous and that it is a useful field of human inquiry. And yet, something like the Pythagorean theorem, how do you prove that? You don't just go around and measure a bunch of right triangles and see, do the results approximate at least to the third decimal place, what Pythagoras said, that, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, if a and b are the short legs of a right triangle and c is the long leg, right? So how do you do it? Well, you make some axioms and you go through, and then you just literally prove, if you give me these assumptions, that we're dealing with a right triangle, and you have to define your terms and stuff. And then we agree on very reasonable, sort of undeniable moves that I can make in geometry. Like, if I have this, well, then I can do this, right? And yeah, of course can. If you grant that kind of stuff, well, then boom, I can show you a squared plus b squared necessarily equals c squared for any right triangle, right? And then once you have that and you understood the proof, it's yours forever. You don't need to go test it. That would be superfluous. You can test it if you want, but if you get the wrong, if it looks like it doesn't work, it's because you either did the math wrong or because it's not really a right triangle. Okay, so now, and having gone through that, it would be also silly once you understand how geometry works to say, oh, well, we're not really learning anything new about the world. That's just, we're kind of building in the result at the front end. I mean, so there's a sense in which, all the results of a theorem are contained in the premises. That's true in a sense, but it still makes sense for people who want to go build bridges to first study Euclidean geometry and to understand all that stuff. You need to know more than that, but it makes sense to go do that. It's not just like, oh yeah, you already knew that from the moment you were born or something, that knowledge was always inside of you. And so what's the point, right? There's more to like the Pythagorean theorem than someone just saying a bachelor is an unmarried male, right? Like that's a tautology, that's a priori. You don't have to go test various bachelors and see, are you an unmarried male? Are you an unmarried male? Yep. 100% of the time, the survey I conducted, the bachelors were, you see what it's like, no, that's just the definition. That's just what we mean by that term. So there's a sense in which, all we mean, or what we mean by right triangle implies a squared plus b squared equals c squared. But you see how it seems like you learned more about the world by thinking through that rather than just someone telling you the definition, right? And so the best exposition I've seen is by Hans Hoppe in his book, Economic Science and the Austrian Method. So we'll link to that too. There's a free PDF available at the Institute's website on that, where he just explains it. So let me just give you a brief snippet. So the idea is, by starting with primitive axioms or assumptions, you can then deduce things logically, step by step. You're not going out and testing it empirically, but what you end up with is more useful to you. Like you feel like you understand that subject matter better than you did at the start of your deductive introspection, or if somebody else teaches it to you and like guides you down this chain of reasoning that you might never have stumbled upon yourself. Then once you have that chain of reasoning under your belt, you're like, yes, and you're walking around and you can just see the world with this new framework that's necessarily correct. Okay? And so, for example, a statement like every action or every choice necessarily incurs an opportunity cost. Okay? That's a statement that if we had time, and I do it in my Lessons for the Young Economist, by the way, that book, I try to unpack some of this stuff more step by step. I'll put a link to that too. first I would have to define the terms, make you understand what I'm even talking about. But eventually we would get to a point where I would say, if someone makes a choice, or if an actor makes a choice, he or she necessarily incurs an opportunity cost. And that statement is not testable. It's not like I would go out and say, okay, let me go sample 1,000 people who make choices, and then I want to see in how many of those cases did they incur an opportunity cost because they made that choice. Like that, you're missing the point. That no, given that we're going to evaluate a particular thing that we're observing, an event that we're seeing, and saying the way I'm interpreting that is there is a conscious being that's making a choice, that's acting, then necessarily there was an opportunity cost involved in that choice. Okay, so just to be clear here, it's because I may have triggered some people when I said it's necessarily correct framework, or I forget the exact wording I use. If I take a rock and I throw it, and it kind of goes up in the air first and then comes down in a parabolic fashion, you wouldn't say, or I wouldn't say, oh yeah, the rock chose originally to go up a bit, and then it decided it preferred to be lower, and so it chose to come down, and there must have been an opportunity cost involved with its choice to come down. I guess it was the value the rock placed on staying at that higher altitude would be the opportunity cost of its choice to. I wouldn't talk like that. Okay, but the reason is because I'm saying I don't interpret the sensory data coming into my eyes and stuff from what just happened is that the rock chose anything. All right, so it's not that the rock did choose something and my theory was wrong and therefore opportunity cost wasn't involved in that particular episode. It's that no, I wouldn't even describe that as a rock choosing anything. Okay, and so that's where like praxeology and to discover, is this relevant or applicable here? That's where it would come in, is you have to decide for some particular phenomenon that you're evaluating, am I going to interpret this as conscious, willful action versus mindless behavior? Okay, and so again, starting from the premise like the humans act, then you can make deductions, but that doesn't tell you where do you apply that to. Like for a particular example, is that person acting or not? Right? If somebody's sleeping and then there's an earthquake and he falls out of bed onto the floor, you wouldn't necessarily have to say, oh, he chose to go on the floor because on his value scale, being on the floor was higher. No, but you just say he just fell out. That's just gravity operating on his body. That wasn't a conscious choice on his part. Or, the doctor hits your knee with the hammer and your leg goes up. That's an unconscious reflex. It's not that you preferred to raise your leg than to keep it down. Okay. Now, if you see the doctor coming with the hammer, you could say you preferred to allow him to hit your leg than to stop him, because that was a choice on your part, right? So you see how this stuff, gets tricky and how to apply it. But the point is, once you decide to deploy praxeology to a situation and you think that the assumptions are satisfied, well, then the results, the conclusions pop out necessarily, unless you made, a mistake in your deductive reasoning. All right. And so again, there's a lot of stuff you can deduce about economics. And I don't even mean stuff like what causes the business cycle, which is really complicated. I'm saying more simpler things like if you open up a micro textbook, especially like an undergrad one, they might have an early section about like how to think like an economist or something like that. And they'll list a bunch of bullet points and there'll be things like people respond to incentives. And I'm saying a statement like that, that's not falsifiable. That's not like saying nothing can go faster than light, right? That in principle, you could observe something going faster than light, and the physicists would have to say, oh, I guess Einstein was wrong. That's surprising. But economists aren't going to ever look at something and say, oh, people didn't respond to incentives there. Right? That if you go up to somebody and say, hey, I'll pay you $10 if you chop your left hand off. And they say no. The conclusion isn't, oh, I guess people don't respond to incentives. You would just say that's not enough of an incentive. Or you could, really get abstract about it and say he responded to the incentive of not wanting to bleed out. Okay? But you get what I'm saying? But also, too, you might say, oh, so it's vacuous. No, it's not. A lot of social scientists unfamiliar with economics go around and say all kinds of goofy stuff, and they look at something, especially like, some new program that the government introduces, and they think X, Y, and Z are going to happen, and it blows up in their face. And why? Is because they did not adequately account for the fact that people respond to incentives. So it's not vacuous. Economists are good for stressing that, and that's what we're known for. That's kind of what we do in a situation. Like, to give you an example, people afterward, like Daniel Moynihan, is talking about the so-called war on poverty and saying, the government started paying single mothers, more if they had kids, and, they would get a bigger check if they weren't married because, there's not like a male breadwinner. And then we wonder, geez, how come the rate of unwed motherhood went up over time? And maybe the fact that the government's paying for an outcome subsidizes it and makes it happen more often than otherwise would have, right? And so I'm saying to a lot of people, they would say, oh, so that can't, no, it's not like some girl who's 17 decides, oh, because the government's going to pay me this check, I'm therefore going to get pregnant from my boyfriend and then, drop out of school and not marry him because he's a jerk and blah, blah, blah. And right, it's not that in any given case, but economists think, empirically, in general, you'd be surprised at how much you add an incentive to something and then that changes the aggregate outcome. Okay, so there is a mix of the empirical to decide, is this relevant? Is this important? But the insight that people respond to incentives, that's kind of just a decision at the front end. Like, this is how we're going to analyze the situation. You could never falsify that, like the statement per se. Okay, so that's kind of just my thoughts on this general topic of, is economics a science or not? I will put links, as I say, to various things in the show notes page if you want to do more reading on this. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. See you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.